Hi, my name is Henry Brooke. I'm a patron of PBI, Peace Brigades International, who provide human rights defenders to certain parts of the world where brave lawyers and other human rights defenders are working in very difficult conditions, and Colombia is one of them. I'm also the honorary president of the Alliance for Lawyers at Risk, which is a fairly amorphous group of lawyers who are keen to help in a practical way, to give moral and political support to those whose stories we are hearing, who come from places where the practice of the law is a great deal more dangerous than it has ever been, I think, in this country, certainly for 500 years. And those two organizations are proud to host this event along with the Bar Human Rights Committee, whose chair, Kirsty, will be speaking as soon as I sit down. This is going to be an enthralling evening. It is the story of a tragedy, and a tragedy that at present has no bright lights at the end of the tunnel. The story of a small farming community among the mountains in northwest Colombia. In the last 17 years, 200 members of that community have been killed. There have been 2,400 serious human rights violations, none of which have resulted in punishment for those who are responsible. And you will hear how the peace community declared itself neutral in the time of conflict, what that means, and how there are still great dangers around. Before you hear from our two guest speakers, you'll hear first from Kirsty Brimelow, who has herself been out to Colombia twice in the last 12 months or so, and has herself visited the peace community. After her, Gwen Burnyeat, who is a former volunteer for PBI, and former volunteer not only in Colombia, but also in the area of Colombia where the community is located. And she'll talk to you about her experiences there and what the community is facing. And after that, we will have two presentations, one from Jesús Emilio, who is wearing an extremely handsome hat on the far left, and the other from Arley. I'm not quite sure in which order they will be speaking, but we'll have to wait and see. They will be translated. They will each speak for about 20 minutes, and after that, there will be a question-and-answer session. So that's what the evening holds, and I'll let those who really know about these things get on with it. Kirsty.
I am very much the supporting act here. So I'm just going to talk for 5 minutes, literally, on an overview on the peace community. Now, today is the first anniversary of the beginning of the peace talks between the Colombian government and FARC. And no doubt a lot of you will have been following those talks and the progress that has been made. The aim of the talks is to end 5 decades of conflict in which some 220,000 people have lost their lives. Incredible statistics. Now, President Santos, in a recent interview, said, "We are working on an accord to end the conflict and change bullets for votes and arms for arguments." Now, of course, this is what the San Jose peace community started to do in 1997 when it set itself up as a neutral humanitarian zone. And this is one of the reasons why the peace community is not only important in itself, but it is very much crucial within the context of Colombia as a country as a whole. If the peace community can succeed, then we would say so can peace in Colombia as a country. It's an interesting corollary. Now, I visited the San Jose peace community last year, and I represented the Bar Human Rights Committee, and I was one of the lawyers in the UK Caravana, and Sarah Chandler, who's sitting right in front of me, was one of the chief organisers and chaired the Caravana. And it was a great trip. And I have to mention two of the solicitors who were with me on the visit. One's here, has come over from Ireland, especially Sean O'Reilly, and also Keith Everington were both with me. And actually on Saturday, I met again Jesús and Arley, only this time in a flat in Kentish Town, which is a little surreal. And then here they are. I'm very privileged to speaking alongside them this evening. Now, the law, because that's what I do, international human rights law, international humanitarian law. Well, the peace community is under precautionary measures from the Inter-American Court and also the Inter-American Commission. Those measures having come in 2004, and then similar declarations from the Constitutional Court in 2007, and ongoing monitoring in 2012 and to this day. In addition, the UN has visited Colombia on a regular basis through its special rapporteurs, and also taken reports from Colombia. And the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Philip Alston, found, perhaps not surprisingly, but found that killings disproportionately affect rural and poor populations. Indigenous and Afro-Colombians, trade unionists, human rights defenders, and community leaders. And those of you who have knowledge of the San Jose community will know, in fact, how incredibly brave these people are and how they have suffered. The 2005 massacre, which I'm sure we will hear about, still resonates there and is spoken about with great agitation to anyone who visits that community. The culture of impunity in Colombia as a whole is one which is a big, big issue. Philip Alston also found that there was a systemic problem with falso positivos, and he found evidence of that in 13 departments. So this is where people are murdered and then they're dressed up, usually fairly ineptly, to look like they were members of the FARC or ELN, a guerrilla. He also found that the government had taken steps since 2007, including disciplinary sanctions and increased cooperation with the UN and the ICRC, including delegating inspectors to army divisions and so on, and looking into deaths in combat. But again, there was problems with lack of staff, and that's one of the things that we found in terms of funding and complaints of funding coming through from the Fiscalia. Now, there's the Justice and Peace Law, which is still perhaps creaking along, but again, subject to a lot of criticism because primarily because of the light sentences that people get, 5 to 8 years in low security prisons, reduced by 18 months because of time in the process. So back to the peace community, though, and the peace talks. Well, the Bar Human Rights Committee has been working in Colombia for many, many years. And this, in fact, is a slide from, thank you, Gwen, a slide from a previous visit where a lot of those displaced in Colombia end up. This is Ciudad Boulevard on the outskirts of Bogota. Colombia still has the second highest internally displaced population in the world after Sudan. You might have to hold. Yes. Well, there you go. It's actually quite good fun in there because we did have quite a good evening. But I'm sure we can flick through the other photos shortly. There's some of the community. The other work that the Bar Human Rights Committee has done has been intervening in cases in amicus briefs, and that's been intervening at, there we go, thank you, that's the San Jose Peace Community, a rather motley looking bunch of us there, all posing for the camera. As we go back, that's the sort of declaration as you're actually going into the community with the principles of participating in the community. And you can just see just how beautiful it is. You just get an idea of there's the entrance to it. The other work that the Bar Human Rights Committee has done has also been carrying out training in international human rights law, which is very essential, and the community will demonstrate just how well, in fact, that they use the law. Implementation, however, is the big struggle. But really, to conclude, what I would do is whilst not in any way supporting impunity, I would take some words of President Santos, who recently said, "La paz no un paso atrás." So peace, not a backward step. So the necessity to look forward, whilst, of course, needing reparation for past atrocities, is something that we as an organisation very much support. But in particular, we do say to the San Jose Peace Community, tú no estás solo, you are not alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Henry, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here today with Kirsty and Sir Henry, and speaking alongside Jesús, Emilio and Arley, who I got to know over the last 2 years as I was accompanying the peace community in the field for Peace Brigades International. PBI, for those of you who don't know, is an international organisation that for over 30 years has been providing international protective accompaniment to human rights defenders at risk in areas of conflict. We do this by sending teams of unarmed international observers into the field to walk alongside human rights defenders who are threatened because of the peaceful and legal work that they're doing to campaign for human rights in their countries. This physical presence on the ground is backed up by a strategic advocacy effort at the local, national and international levels, and this combined effect creates a deterrence against those who would wish to carry out threats against the human rights defenders that we accompany. The peace community, as Sir Henry mentioned, is situated, and you're seeing wonderful photos of them here from one of our ex-volunteers, Alejandro González, is situated up in the northwest of Colombia in a region called Urabá. It's a very geographically strategic location. This is where north joins south. And in fact, if it wasn't for this region of Urabá and also the southern tip of Panama, you could drive down the Pan American Highway right from the top of Alaska to the southern tip of Chile. Urabá has been one of the epicenters of the Colombian conflict. It was one of the areas in which paramilitarism was born and spread and committed thousands of atrocities against civilians, often in collaboration with the armed forces. And one tragic example that Kirsty referred to of the many violations that the peace community themselves have suffered that shows this collaboration between the armed forces and the paramilitaries was a massacre in 2005 in one of their rural areas of 8 members of the community, including 3 children, one of whom was only 21 months old. Perhaps for those who don't understand Colombia so well or who are new to it, the paramilitary organization, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or the AUC, was founded in the 1990s, but rests on a tradition of paramilitarism that dates back 5 decades. During the 1990s and 2000s, under this paramilitary organization, civilians, in their most part rural civilians in Urabá, were persecuted. There were massacres, murders, threats, stigmatization, torture, sexual violence, economic blockades, illegal checkpoints, and all the human rights violations you can think of, and very key forced displacement on a mass level. Urabá is actually also one of the centers of community initiatives that seek to break the cycle of violence with pacific alternatives, such as that the peace community shows us. Let me zoom out a little bit further just to look at the situation of human rights defenders in Colombia. PBI, along with other international organizations, have been raising concerns consistently about the situation of human rights defenders on the ground in Colombia with our international support network, such as from our office here in the UK. Over the last year, the same period in which the peace talks have been going on, the situation on the ground for human rights defenders has actually got worse. The statistics from recent reports show that the group that is most responsible for violations against human rights defenders is, in fact, the continuing presence of paramilitary groups, at 59% of the abuses against human rights defenders being carried out by them. There was a demobilization process in 2005, which has been very controversial and much criticized by different international institutions. But increasingly, different organizations show and document the fact that these groups, in large part, continue to operate much in the same way, with the same structures, the same modus operandi, and in many areas continue their relationship and their collaboration with the Colombian armed forces. In fact, Human Rights Watch recently produced a report going into more detail about one of these groups in particular, which is the group that operates in the region where the peace community is situated, called the Gaitanista Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AGC. And Human Rights Watch documents that this is the biggest group in Colombia at the moment, with 2,370 combatants. And they cite Colombian police intelligence, which says that this group has national hierarchy and cohesion. And in fact, one of their institutional sources said to them that all they've done is change their name. So this is a very worrying situation for PBI, for the human rights defenders who we accompany, who are very at risk from these groups. And if nothing is done to address this, then this situation is going to continue. Going back to Urabá now, this is an area of incredible biodiversity and is very, very rich in natural resources. You've got sources of coal, oil, immense water reserves, minerals, gold, and it's an incredibly fertile land which is very attractive to agro-businesses. Historically, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, as I mentioned, this wave of violence carried out against civilians, resulting in the mass displacement of thousands of families, these human rights violations have gone hand in hand with illegal appropriation of the land and exploitation of it for business interests. Just to give an example, in the region of Urabá, in 2005, paramilitary commander Vicente Castaño admitted in an interview to recruiting palm oil businesses to move on to stolen land in Urabá and operate there. In fact, there are currently several palm oil businesses under investigation for this case. The charges against them are for forced displacement of the farmer population that lived in the zone, and for financing and collaborating with these illegal armed groups, and for invasion of areas designated as of special ecological importance. And PBI recently received news of a particular threat that was going around this region, saying that if the businessmen had to pay jail time, or if they had to give any of the land that they were using back, then community leaders would die. So this is a very explicitly worded threat. The situation for the peace community over the last year, the same period that the peace talks have been ongoing, is extremely severe. There have been forced disappearances, mass forced displacement, threats of extermination of the peace community explicitly, and many other worrying aggressions. The Colombian government has been saying now for 9 years since the demobilization process that the paramilitary structures are no longer the same, that they've demobilized and some of them have regrouped, and then they're now criminal bands rather than paramilitaries. There's no longer so much centralization, they're not working in the same way. And I'm sure that there are differences in how they're working. We PBI volunteers in the field, we can testify to what the peace community have been systematically documenting over the last 17 years in their careful registration of all the violations committed against them, specifically in regard to the paramilitary presence in their territory. We've seen them in military fatigues, heavily armed with radio equipment and operating close by army installations. But they'll tell you more about what their situation has been like. For me, accompanying the peace community has been an experience of learning and personal growth, because despite all of the hardships that they've suffered over the years and continue to suffer today, they are putting into reality every day a real concept of peace, meaning not just the absence of war, but the establishment of a real collective construction together of economic and social justice and respect for human rights. And I think they have a lot to teach us, also about the sense of what community means in a time in which we're increasingly thinking about globalization and how wealth and power is increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. What does community mean? How do we live together? How do we work together with a sense of solidarity and collectivity? I think the peace community really has an experience that is an inspiration to everybody. But I'm just a witness. These guys are on the front line. So I think I'll pass over to them now. Thank you.
Bueno, primero que todo, buenas noches. Queremos dar los más sinceros agradecimientos a todas y a todos, los facilitadores, a todas las organizaciones, a todas las personas que están presentes en nombre de la Comunidad de Paz de San José de Apartadó.
We're not quite sure how we're going to do this, but first of all, good evening. I'd like to give my most sincere thanks to all the men and women who are here, to the people who have facilitated, who've organised the event, to the organisers, to all the organisations and individuals who are represented here. In the name of the Peace Community of San José de Apartadó, thank you.
Bueno, como ya Wendy hacía un poco de recuento la situación en que vivimos la Comunidad de Paz de San José de Apartadó, quiero resumir un poco más de la situación y voy a intentar hacerlo muy breve porque falta el otro compañero y creo que el tiempo es corto.
Okay, Gwen has already told you a little about the peace community of San Jose. I want to speak a little bit more about it to summarize our situation. I'm going to try and be as brief as I can because my colleague is going to speak as well, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the community.
Como lo narraba Wendy, la comunidad de paz nace en toda esa situación de violencia que vivimos desde hace muchos años en Colombia, y un grupo de campesinos que quisimos realmente visibilizar todas esas graves violaciones a los derechos humanos, y firmamos una declaratoria el 23 de marzo para exigirle a todos los actores armados el respeto de la población civil, amparándonos en el derecho internacional humanitario.
As Gwen has said, the peace community was born in the midst of this violence that has been talked about and that we've suffered for many, many years. We're just a group of peasants who got together and we decided that we wanted to illustrate the violations of human rights that we have been suffering. And so on the 23rd of March, on the 23rd of March of 1997, we issued a public declaration to all of the armed groups within the framework of international humanitarian law to demand that they stopped violating our rights.
Hasta el momento, la situación para nosotros, la comunidad de paz, no ha cambiado. Siempre ha sido la misma violación a los derechos humanos, la persecución de muerte por parte del Estado colombiano junto con los paramilitares y algunas acciones que también ha cometido la guerrilla contra la comunidad de paz. En este momento estamos hablando de que la presencia paramilitar, la relación de la fuerza pública y las instituciones del Estado colombiano con el paramilitarismo sigue igual. Sigue el desplazamiento forzado, siguen las muertes selectivas, las desapariciones. Yo creo que el desplazamiento de unas 35 familias en estos últimos 2 meses, y que eso ha sido verificado por grupos internacionales que nos han acompañado en las peregrinaciones que hemos hecho a la vereda Rodosalí, La Hoz y Zabaleta.
So for now, for the San Jose community, there has been no change. The same violations of human rights, the same persecution, the same collaboration between the state and the paramilitaries, and also, we must say, certain actions of the guerrilla groups as well. We continue to be victims of all of these armed groups. And now, I just have to affirm that the presence of the paramilitaries and the collaboration between the armed forces, state institutions and the paramilitaries remains the same as it always has been. Displacement continues, selective murders continue, disappearances continue. And indeed, over the last 2 months, there have been the forced displacement of over 35 families from the peace community of San Jose. And the fact of this has been confirmed by international observers who have accompanied us, who have been on what we call pilgrimages with us to different veredas, to different rural areas in the territory that we call the San Jose Peace Community.
Los asesinatos en este año, estamos hablando ya de unos 11 asesinatos cometidos por los militares, por paramilitares y también algunas muertes causadas por la guerrilla. Los actores armados todos siguen presentes en la zona, una zona que siempre ha estado militarizada, la fuerte presencia de unos 1000 paramilitares en 3 bases paramilitares que hemos denunciado durante todos estos ya casi 17 años. La confrontación entre la guerrilla y militares y paramilitares, también muchas muertes entre ellos. La zona a veces sometida a ametrallamientos y bombardeos indiscriminados.
This year, there have been 11 murders in our community, carried out by members of the armed forces, by paramilitaries, and in some cases by guerrilla groups. The same actors are there that have always been there. There are over 1,000, there are about 1,000 paramilitaries operating in the region from 3 paramilitary bases based around our community that we have been informing the authorities about for the last 17 years of our existence. They're still operating. And there are also confrontations between the military, armed confrontations between the military, the paramilitary groups and the guerrillas, which leave their own trail of death. There's crossfire of machine guns that are crossing our territories. There's bombardments from the air.
Mientras que exigimos la pronta aparición del desaparecido Buenaventura Hoyos, en el día de ayer fueron retenidas nuevamente otras 6 personas por los paramilitares en una vereda de retorno de la comunidad de paz llamada Arenas Altas. Entre ellos 5 menores de edad y en este momento están desaparecidos en manos de los paramilitares.
While we are calling for the return of our disappeared comrade, Buenaventura Hoyos, who is in the hands of the paramilitaries, while we're still seeking his return, just yesterday, 6 members of our community were disappeared, 5 of whom are children, in the rural area, the vereda called Arenas Altas.
Nosotros como comunidad seguimos dejando nuestras exigencias del respeto a la población civil y dejando la constancia a todas las organizaciones internacionales en esa búsqueda realmente de algún día tener un derecho de vivir en paz y vivir tranquilos. La comunidad de paz al Estado colombiano nunca le hemos exigido un solo peso, simplemente le hemos exigido que nos respete la vida, que nos deje trabajar tranquilos, pero no ha sido posible. Por eso, para nosotros, una vez más le exigimos a la comunidad internacional que nos acompañen y que nos puedan ayudar a ver si en algún momento la situación cambia para nosotros.
So we continue as the community of San José de Apartadó to make our demands to respect the civilian population. And we continue to provide evidence, provide information on what is happening, so that we really enjoy the right to life and the right to peace. We have never asked for money from our government, but for life, the right to life, and the right to work. But it's not been possible, despite the repeated requests and demands that we have made. So again, I say to the community, the international community, any help that you can provide for us, any support that you can provide for us, really, really helps us achieve the goals and achieve the demands that we're making.
Una de las grandes preocupaciones para nosotros es que en estos últimos gobiernos el Estado colombiano ha sido tomado como ejemplo en el mundo. Entendemos que somos el segundo país más criminal. Unos gobiernos que no respetan la Constitución Nacional ni ninguno de los tratados internacionales. Y es lamentable que de pronto realmente seamos tomados o que el Estado colombiano sea tomado como ejemplo. O realmente no sabemos entonces la humanidad qué es lo que queremos. Si es que los estados más criminales van a ser los que vamos a tener como ejemplo para la humanidad, el futuro de la humanidad está fracasada entonces. Y por eso hemos exigido en esta gira con todos los eurodiputados en Italia, Alemania, en el Parlamento Europeo, exigiéndoles por qué han firmado un tratado de libre comercio y que nos digan entonces dónde están las pautas de derechos humanos dentro de los tratados de libre comercio.
One of our major concerns is that recent governments, under the tenure of recent governments, the Colombian state has been held up internationally as an example for the world. But it's the second most criminal state in the world. We don't understand how a government like the Colombian government that doesn't respect the constitution and doesn't respect the international human rights conventions of which it's a signatory, why it should be held up as an example to the world as a model state. It is a shame that the Colombian state should be held up as an example to the rest of the world. And we don't understand really that if this government, if this state is an example to the world, well really we fear for the future of humankind. So we've been saying repeatedly in Europe to MEPs, to members of the parliaments in Italy and Germany, at the European Parliament, we've been asking why the free trade agreement? And if you're going to have a free trade agreement with Colombia, where are the human rights clauses?
Dentro de todas estas graves violaciones a los derechos humanos, sabemos claramente que varias multinacionales han estado involucradas, como es el caso de Chiquita Brand, la de bananos, que nosotros fuimos los demandantes y aceptaron la responsabilidad de cierta forma. Está Coca-Cola, que también ha sido responsable de los asesinatos de sindicalistas, también con una relación con el paramilitarismo. Entre eso, algo otras que uno pudiera mencionar, pero como ejemplo es. Entonces yo creo que para nosotros, de verdad que quisiéramos que nos ayudaran con información para saber otras multinacionales que están licitando en la zona donde está la comunidad de paz para explotar carbón, para explotar petróleo y algo otros minerales.
And we know that there are transnational companies, multinational companies involved in this situation that I've been describing. For instance, Chiquita Brands, the banana producer. We, the community, were behind some of the complaints that were taken to that went to court in the United States and that got some degree of recognition of responsibility by Chiquita Brands. Coca-Cola, working directly with paramilitaries responsible for the murder of trade unionists, and there are other cases as well that I won't go into. So really, for us, it's very important to have help from you in your countries, in the international community, also to help us to get information about other transnational companies that have got designs on the territory adjacent to or within the peace community who have interests in coal mining, in oil exploration, or in mineral extraction.
Lo último sería lo que hemos querido de lo de Chiquita Brand, que los directivos sean extraditados a Colombia para que algún día por lo menos se conozca la verdad, que otras empresas colombianas, políticos que hayan estado involucrados, pero a eso la respuesta que tuvimos, yo creo que todos la conocen, no era posible porque Colombia no reunía las condiciones de seguridad para que ellos fueran traídos a Colombia. Nosotros seguiremos en esa propuesta. Necesitamos conocer la verdad.
And finally, in relation to Chiquita, we maintain our demand on that as we try to really extract the truth about the situation. We want the management of Chiquita, the responsible management of Chiquita Brands, to be extradited to Colombia so that we can learn the truth in a Colombian court of law. Now, we know that that request was denied because it was argued that Colombia didn't have the necessary guarantees in its legal system for a fair trial to take place. But we're going for the guarantees to allow a fair trial to take place. But we are going to maintain ourselves firm with this demand that the management, the senior management of Chiquita Brands should be extradited to Colombia so that they can answer the charges in our country.
Bueno, como lo dijo Jesús Emilio, también muchas gracias por la oportunidad que nos dan de estar aquí y también por haber venido a escucharnos. Bueno, vamos a parar.
As Jesús Emilio said, also many thanks for giving us the opportunity to be here and for listening to what we have to say.
Como Jesús Emilio nos narraba en breves palabras esta desgarradora historia que en estos 16, casi 17 años en comunidad la hemos sobrevivido, lo hemos experimentado, adultos, jóvenes, ancianos, niños. Una historia de dolor, pero que en medio de ese dolor la comunidad se ha trazado un camino muy concreto, y es de superar ese dolor. Y nosotros como comunidad hemos dicho, mientras la comunidad convierta ese dolor en esperanza, siempre habrá comunidad.
So, as Jesús Emilio said, we've been experiencing a powerful, a profound history over the last 16, nearly 17 years. But with all that's happened, San Jose has survived. And all that has happened has been experienced by adults, by the young, by the old, by children, the pain and the suffering. But we feel that we're on a concrete path, a real solid path. And that path is the one to overcome pain and suffering and build of it hope and a future.
Jesús Emilio nos compartía un poco la situación de la comunidad. Yo voy a compartir un poco más, es cuál ha sido la relación entre el Estado, cuál ha sido la atención que el Estado le ha brindado a la comunidad de paz en estos casi 17 años que hemos tenido como comunidad de paz. Pero antes de entrar a eso, yo quisiera mencionar que a nosotros en la comunidad nos preocupa enormemente que ahorita que el gobierno habla de diálogos de paz, que habla de acuerdos de paz entre Estado y FARC, mientras allí el gobierno intenta dirigir la atención de la comunidad internacional a unos acuerdos de paz, se está ocultando otra realidad, esa realidad que vivimos nosotros, esa realidad que vive la comunidad de paz en la región, una realidad que no solamente vivimos nosotros, sino que vive mucha gente en el país, y que esa realidad está siendo desconocida por el gobierno de Colombia, pero que también la comunidad internacional se está centrando la atención a otro nivel.
Jesús Emilio talked principally about the situation of the community. I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between the state and the community, the kind of attention that the state has given to the community. But first I want to express a real concern that we have, which is that in these times of dialogue, of conversations for peace, of arriving at a peace agreement between the state and the FARC, the government is interested in turning the eyes of the international community to this discourse of peace. But this discourse is hiding another reality that the members of San José de Apartadó and many others across the country are experiencing. And these are being ignored. These realities that we're living are being ignored both by the government in Colombia, but also in large part by the international community, whose focus is elsewhere, on the higher level of the peace talks.
Una de las cosas que ha generado tanta persecución contra la comunidad ha sido el hecho de que nosotros no queramos aceptar que nos maten, que nos desplacen, que nos torturen, que nos asesinen, que cometan todo tipo de crimen contra la comunidad. El hecho de que nosotros como comunidad rechacemos eso y no queramos aceptar eso de las unidades del Estado conjuntamente con los paramilitares, el gobierno lo que ha hecho es acusarnos de guerrilleros. Nos acusa de guerrilleros porque los denunciamos cuando nos matan. Nos acusan de guerrillero porque les denunciamos cuando nos desplazan. Nos acusan de guerrillero cuando nosotros decimos la verdad y contamos la realidad que vivimos allí. Esa ha sido la historia. Esa ha sido la historia que ha marcado una persecución del Estado, de sus instituciones contra la comunidad, como si fuéramos unos criminales. Una persecución sin fin. En estos casi 17 años hemos sobrevivido a muchas agresiones, de todo tipo de agresiones, de violaciones a los derechos humanos. Y a pesar de que la comunidad, en los primeros 8 años como comunidad, mantuvimos una relación, una interlocución con el alto gobierno, en ese entonces hasta con el gobierno del presidente Uribe, que tuvimos una relación, una interlocución directa con el alto gobierno. Sin embargo, y a pesar de esa interlocución, a pesar de ese anhelo de la comunidad por buscar de que se superara y se pusiera fin a la persecución sin fin contra la comunidad, el Estado no hizo otra cosa más que perseguirnos. A pesar de que la comunidad en diversas ocasiones le decía a los mandos en la Brigada 17, que tiene jurisdicción donde está la comunidad de paz, que ponía en conocimiento de los altos mandos allí de la presencia paramilitar en la región, inmediatamente esa información era suministrada a los paramilitares, y cuando los miembros de nuestra comunidad venían de regreso al caserío de la comunidad, eran interceptados, bajados por retenes paramilitares que decían: sabemos dónde estaban ustedes, sabemos lo que ustedes le estaban diciendo a la Brigada 17, y a muchos de nuestros compañeros los asesinaron allí.
So first, the actions against the community, against the peace community. Our crime, the mistake that we made, was that we didn't want to allow our people to be killed, to be displaced, to be tortured, to be murdered, to suffer endless numbers of crimes. We rejected it. The fact that we rejected this model meant that these crimes and tortures, etc., committed by the state and the paramilitaries led to the response of the state being that we were accused of being members of the guerrilla. We were criticising the state and their paramilitary allies, and we were automatically turned into guerrillas. If we complained about murder and disappearances and displacements, if we asked for the truth, the government said that we were guerrillas. And that's been the history of the community. We've been persecuted by the state as if we were criminals. It's been an endless history during the 17 years that we have been operating as a peace community. And we have survived during that period many, many violations of our human rights. And this is despite the fact that for the first 8 years of our existence as a peace community, we maintained permanent dialogue with the Colombian authorities, with the Colombian government. We maintained permanent high-level dialogue with the government right up to the administration of Álvaro Uribe Vélez. And despite the fact that we would give information, for instance, if we were meeting with the 17th Brigade, the local brigade in Urubá, about the presence of the paramilitaries in our territory. What happened if we did that? The information of what we had said, who had been there, where we had said it, was passed directly to the paramilitaries, so that when the representatives who had been speaking to the 17th Brigade were on the way back to the community, they were stopped at illegal roadblocks, and the paramilitary said, we know where you've been, we know what you've said, we know who you were talking to. And many of the members of our community were killed as a result of these activities.
A pesar de que la comunidad en los primeros 8 años, como comunidad de paz, puso en conocimiento de esas violaciones que hasta ese momento se daba contra la comunidad, la puso en conocimiento inclusive a través de declaraciones, de denuncias oficiales que miembros de la comunidad hicieron ante las autoridades judiciales en Colombia. Sin embargo, esto también se repetía, que cada vez que los miembros de la comunidad iban y denunciaban ante las autoridades judiciales en Apartadó, cuando venían de regreso, los retenes paramilitares bajaban nuestra gente, mataron a muchos de los miembros que denunciaron. Los que no fueron asesinados, el ejército y la fiscalía, las autoridades judiciales lo que hicieron fue perseguirlos, hacerles un montaje y luego judicializarlos, y muchos de ellos fueron encarcelados. Una estrategia de que el que no era asesinado lo judicializamos, es decir, que si nosotros denunciábamos como víctimas, denunciábamos ser víctimas, el Estado nos convirtió en victimarios y nos persiguió, y a muchos los encarceló, a otros los asesinó. Después, como ejemplo de lo de la interlocución que la comunidad tenía con el alto gobierno, habíamos delegado a Luis Eduardo Guerra, un líder histórico en la comunidad, que fuera el vocero, representante de la comunidad ante el alto gobierno, y en muchas ocasiones se reunió con el alto gobierno, con el vicepresidente de ese entonces, Francisco Santos. Sin embargo, y a pesar de la denuncia que la comunidad hizo a finales del 2004 de que se preparaba una masacre contra la comunidad de paz, que lo pusimos ante todas las autoridades colombianas, el Estado no hizo nada. Y el 21 de febrero del 2005, el Estado, con los paramilitares, cometieron la horrenda masacre que muchos conocen, la del 21 de febrero, donde no solamente asesinaron a Luis Eduardo Guerra, el que interlocutaba con el alto gobierno, sino a su hijo, de 11 años, a un bebecito, que Gwen dijo 21 meses, pero es 18 meses de edad. El ejército, con los paramilitares, los descuartizaron, como descuartizando un pollo, y los enterraron allí. Esa ha sido la realidad. Eso ha sido a la realidad que a nuestra comunidad, a nuestro pueblo nos han sometido. La comunidad no vio otra cosa más que reclamar dignamente una posición y romper con el Estado. Rompimos esa interlocución con la justicia, rompimos esa interlocución que había con el alto gobierno, porque vimos que el mensaje del gobierno, el mensaje de una práctica sistemática contra la comunidad era clara. La guerra contra la comunidad estaba declarada y era el exterminio.
So despite the fact that for the first 8 years of our existence, we were providing information on the violations of which we were victims of, we even made official complaints. We even made official complaints within the legal system. We went to the legal system, and the same pattern was repeated. The denunciations, the complaints that we were making to the legal authorities in the regional capital of Apartadó, what happened? The same. The paramilitaries were informed of who had made the complaint, what the complaint was, where we'd been, what time we'd been there. They were detained. The members of the community who'd been making the legal complaints, the complaints, were intercepted in the illegal roadblocks on the way back to San Jose. Many of them were killed. So the same thing was happening with the legal system. Or, if our leaders, if our members weren't killed, then they had to undergo what's called the process of judicialization, criminalization on trumped-up charges. Charges were invented, and then they were pursued through the courts. So if they weren't killed, they were pursued through the courts on trumped-up charges. So the victim, what the state did, was turn the victims of a situation of systematic abuse of human rights into the perpetrators of abuses. The person who was mainly responsible for the spokesperson for the community with these dialogue, with the conversations with the highest levels of government, a man called Luis Eduardo Guerra, who used to regularly speak with the Vice President, Francisco Santos, who was the member of the High Government who was responsible for human rights policy. And despite the fact that the community stated publicly towards the end of 2005 that a massacre was being planned, jointly by the paramilitaries and by the state, nothing was done. So on the 21st of February 2005, state forces with the paramilitaries carried out what is now the notorious massacre of the 21st of February 2005 that some of you will know about, where Luis Eduardo Guerra, the community spokesperson with the high government, with the highest levels of government, his 11-year-old son, and a child that Gwen said was 21 months old, in fact was 18 months old, were murdered, along with others, by the army and the paramilitary. And they cut the child up like you cut up a chicken and buried them. So faced with this, the community took a principled decision to break dialogue that it had been maintaining for 8 years with the state, with the legal system, and with the high levels of government. We decided that this dialogue, what is the point of dialogue with a government that has a demonstrable, systematic plan to liquidate you? This was the decision the community took.
Desde ese entonces han pasado 8 años de ruptura con el Estado. Sin embargo, y a pesar de nuestra posición de ruptura frente al Estado, colocamos 4 condiciones como condiciones para que el Estado de buena fe muestre que quiere nuevamente interlocutar con la comunidad. Voy a mencionar muy brevemente esas 4 condiciones que la comunidad colocó ante el gobierno para que el gobierno cumpla y muestre una buena fe, de buena fe, el querer interlocutar con la comunidad. 1, que se retratara el alto gobierno, el presidente, contra las calumnias que hiciera el presidente en ese entonces, Uribe, en el 2004, el 29 de mayo del 2004 y el 20 de marzo del 2005. Calumnias y difamaciones que hizo contra la comunidad y que eso le dio la vuelta al mundo, a las distintas embajadas a través de la diplomacia colombiana, que mostró y quiso intentar mostrar de que la comunidad éramos guerrilleros y de que los asesinados eran guerrilleros, incluyendo el niño de 18 meses, guerrillero. La segunda condición, que el gobierno levantara las bases de policía y militar que instaló en los espacios de vida y espacios neutrales que la comunidad tiene, sobre todo en San José de Apartadó, que los colocó allí estas bases una vez que cometió la masacre, metió las bases militares por encima de los diálogos que la comunidad estaba sosteniendo, la interlocución con el alto gobierno. La tercera condición, que el gobierno conformara una comisión de evaluación que integrara varias instituciones del Estado y a la comunidad de paz para evaluar caso por caso las multitudes de agresiones que han habido contra la comunidad, que se evaluara y se mirara por qué no ha habido justicia, por qué tanta impunidad. Y la cuarta condición, que el Estado, que el gobierno aceptara las zonas humanitarias, que como nosotros como comunidad hemos declarado unas zonas, unos pequeños espacios como zonas humanitarias, con el objetivo de que en el momento que haya confrontación armada, que haya combates, la población civil se pueda ir allí a ese pequeño espacio a refugiarse. Sin embargo, el gobierno hasta la fecha no ha atendido esas 4 peticiones de la comunidad de paz.
So, despite the fact that for 8 years now we've not been in dialogue with the government, we proposed 4 conditions that the state should meet in order to show its good faith and in order to be able to return to dialogue. The first of these was that the government should formally repudiate and retract statements made by then President Álvaro Uribe Vélez on the 29th of May 2004 and on the 20th of March 2005, in which he accused the community, and in which accusations which went around the world press, which were reported all around the world, he accused the community of being guerrillas and the community of having committed the massacre against itself, including the 18-month-old child. The second condition was that the government should remove the political and military bases that have been established in the life spaces, sort of in the areas that are a part of the community and that were established after the massacre had taken place as an act of, let's say, intimidatory state presence. The third, that the government should establish an evaluation commission with joint membership of members of the community and a range of state institutions in order to analyse case by case what has happened, all of the cases of violation that have occurred against the community, and to answer the question why in none of those cases has there been justice. Why are all of those cases still in impunity? And finally, that the government should accept the model of humanitarian spaces that the community has set up, which basically are safe spaces so that if there are combats in the zone, the community can seek refuge in those spaces and that the state actors, that the armed actors will respect that those are humanitarian zones as a way of protecting the life of the civilian population, the non-armed population. None of those 4 demands have been met.
La Corte Constitucional, que es la máxima corte en Colombia, en 2 ocasiones ha fallado en favor de la comunidad a través de 2 sentencias, dándonos la razón. Y el año pasado, a través de un auto de la Corte Constitucional, el auto 164, le dio órdenes al gobierno, al presidente, le dio órdenes perentorias y la comunidad suspendió la posición de ruptura para permitirle al gobierno de que cumpliera esas órdenes que la Corte le había dado. Y sin embargo, se cumplió el tiempo, se cumplieron las fechas y el gobierno no cumplió. Uno era lo de la retratación, que Santos no quiso asistir a pesar de haberlas postergado por 3 ocasiones. Y la segunda fue la de la comisión de evaluación, que la comunidad acompañó esa comisión de evaluación que se conformó con el gobierno. Y después de 6 meses no se cumplió lo que la Corte ordenó. ¿Qué ordenó la Corte? De que se revisara caso por caso las denuncias de la comunidad. Y en 6 meses esa comisión de evaluación no revisó ni siquiera un solo caso. Entonces hemos visto de que el Estado no tiene ninguna voluntad de cumplir ninguna orden constitucional, ninguna de las leyes de nuestro país. Le importa poco cumplirlo y se llena con la diplomacia en un discurso perverso a las distintas agencias internacionales, organizaciones que nos acompañan, que han clamado al gobierno proteger a la comunidad diciendo de que cumplen, de que han tomado todas las medidas para proteger a la comunidad de paz. Pero ¿de qué medidas estamos hablando? No más ayer, Jesús Emilio mencionó, no más ayer los paramilitares desaparecen a 6 personas. En medio de una fuerte presencia militar, los paramilitares retienen gente. ¿De qué estamos hablando? ¿De qué protección estamos hablando? Nos preocupa mucho, ya para terminar, que en medio de este discurso que el gobierno está dando de los diálogos, de una concertación, de una negociación con la guerrilla, con la FARC, se esté intentando, lo que dije al principio, enfocar la atención internacional al tema de los diálogos. Pero este tema de la situación humanitaria que vivimos muchos en Colombia, esté siendo tapada, ocultada. Le pedimos a todos los que están aquí que no descuiden eso, que no descuiden la atención por la situación humanitaria que se vive en las comunidades, que lo vivimos en la comunidad de paz. Muchas gracias.
And in this context, the Constitutional Court of Colombia has emitted 2 sentences and 1 judicial order, Order 164, in which it obliges, orders the government and the president to carry out certain actions that are included within the list of demands. And the community dropped its stature of non-dialogue with the government in order to allow the measures that the Constitutional Court had ordered the government and the state to implement, in order to allow them to be put into place. We respected what the Constitutional Court ordered, but the government didn't. Even though on 3 occasions he'd said that he was going to, President Santos failed to emit the retraction of the accusations made by President Uribe. And though the Evaluation Commission was established, after 6 months, it had achieved nothing. The Constitutional Court said, as we had demanded, that it had to go case by case, examine case by case all of the violations that had occurred in the community, and at the end of 6 months, no case had been examined. So we say that this is evidence that there is no political will, that the government doesn't respect the Constitution, doesn't respect the legal framework. The government doesn't care. But at the same time, what it does do is focus its energies on a perverse diplomatic discourse in which it seeks to remove the attention of the international community from the denunciations that we make, and that international organisations that accompany us, also make. And what's the reality of this situation that we're living? As Jesús Emilio said, just yesterday, in a zone that is highly militarised, the paramilitaries were able to disappear another 6 members of the community. So what protection is the government providing to us? And I end by repeating that in this context of dialogue and negotiation and agreement with the FARC, What the government is seeking to do is to divert the eyes of the world from the severe humanitarian crisis that we're experiencing, that so many are experiencing in Colombia. And I beg of you not to lose sight of this humanitarian crisis that we and others are experiencing. Thank you very much.